screen, folks. So, as I said, we're going on now to look at what we call imperfect competition. First, we would have just talked about in the previous modules and the previous sections, perfect competition. Imperfect competition, as you can see here, encompass monopoly, oligopoly, and the monopolistic structures altogether, right? Monopolistic competition, that is. So as mentioned before, the perfect competition market structure is hypothetical. In reality, most structures and most markets are found on the one out of these three here, right? So one common feature of these forms of market is that they are all what we call price setters. So remember when we talked about perfect competition, we said that uh, whenever a new firm enters the market, they have to take the going price, right? This is not necessarily the case with these other three structures, and these firms have some amount of influence, either to set the price or influence it in some way, right? So in this case, if an individual firm wants a customer to buy more of their product, they can simply lower their prices. As such, firms in imperfect competition have a downward sloping demand curve, which is the demand curve that we are accustomed to see. Meaning, if we were to go at lower prices, right? If we were to go at lower prices, right? Let's say this is a price we start at, and that is a quantity we're going to get. If we lower the price to perhaps this article, I'm going to read a lower price. Let's say this here was 10 for us. This can now be like 5, right? You can see that the quantity would be a lot more. So this is a difference that these three market structures have. Their demand curve is downward sloping compared to the straight line that we saw earlier, because all firms had to take the going market price, right? And you know, this here, it's basically all we can say on this here before we move into explain the market structures singularly, right? So you can just make a note of these here. Where it's said here, monopoly, oligopoly, and just draw this small diagram here for me, right? And indicate in the chat box with a done that you are finished. So we might more than likely go over 9 tonight.
Sir, can you please zoom in on the diagram? I can see the words that are written at the bottom of the line.
All right, no problem. So this is better for you?
Yes, sir.
Right? It's MR on the one inside and AR equal to D on the one outside, right? So our AR curve is still equal to our demand curve. And our MR, which is our marginal revenue, is trailing inside here. Right, so just give me a done when you are finished with all of this in the chat, making whatever notes you need. So again, this is like the regular demand curve that we know, we are accustomed to, the same rules of demand that we would have looked at whenever ago applies here. And at this point, we should know what is our AR, our average revenue. the average amount we gain for every item we sold, and our marginal revenue, which is the increase in revenue as we sell an additional, or in this case, produce an additional item. You guys done? All right, so moving on, we can now begin to look at the monopoly. A monopoly, you might hear the name from the board game, a monopoly. As you can recall, in the board game, the aim was to um, become the most successful business owner on the field, right? And knock your opponents out. Well, it's a similar sort of dynamic is going on here. A monopoly is a market structure with no competition. So just like the board game in which you look to knock your competition out, a monopoly has no competition. Whether it be, we will look at whether it be for legal reason, whether it be for their control over some natural resource, or whatever the case is, there is no competition. It's the only form producing these goods, and therefore, we say the barrier to entry is high, right? The barrier to entry is very high. And we look at now what are examples of these barriers that enable these monopolies to prosper. Um, a simple one is government regulation, right? Government regulation. These are the laws that limit or prevent new forms from entering an industry, right? Most Caribbean countries, they have set out in legislation that one form alone should produce utilities, which is water and light. Only in the Bahamas, you might see, it's either Bahamas or Barbados, they have two energy producing um, companies, whereas we would say light companies, right? Electricity. Um, so for the entire economy, this is these monopolies exist in the Caribbean to service the entire economy, right? We know the populations are small, so there's another reason why they set out that only one uh, form should exist. In Guyana, we have several as well. You might recall GPL, the Guyana Power and Light. There's Guywa, Guyana Water, and there's GT&T Landline, right? You recall that only GT&T operates in the landline space. If you can think of any other ones in the chat, you can indicate and I'll tell you if you're right or wrong. So let me see what you have as you come up with that. So about monopolies in Guyana, that is not due to regulation, just generally what you think are some regulation monopoly, sorry. So another reason though for why a monopoly might exist is what we call a patent, right? So a patent grants the inventor the exclusive right to the patented product. Some might say patent, some might say patent, right? Potato, potato. So this means that no one is allowed to produce this product, or they will be on the receiving end of legal action. Most time they might be sued, as you guys would say in your local language. However, arrangements can be made to copy the product for heavy fees. Example, when Samsung was sued by Apple for copying their orally aceta multi-touch devices, right? So the first set of iPhones were very much the market leader. with the multi-touch capacity screens, right? You know, first times, you guys know is BlackBerry. You can tell me yes in the chat if you are aware. I know this might be beyond, so yes, yes. So at least you guys know. This is around the 2010 up to 2014 time. This was very big in Guyana, but in 2010, the iPhone, around then, the iPhone came out and that displaced the BlackBerry market and the prevalence that they had and the power they had. And you know, they had a big competition over their Samsung and Google and these other Android competitors. You guys know how old time touchscreen phones used to be. You could only touch one thing at a time, and this patent allowed Apple exclusive right for that period of time to um, have a monopoly. Uh, Patent monopolies are very common as well in the medical industry, right? You know, tablets and technology firms spend a lot of money doing research and development, so they get a patent, right? So we can just add patent monopolies are very common in the medicinal market, right? You know, whenever a new cure is out, you would find that they, a lot of times, which is selfish, but that is the world we live in, they tend to patent it so they can yield the benefits of their research and development, right? So just indicate to me that you're following these two so far before I move on. Uh, a following in the chat is fine, or a clear. And remember, at any point in time you want to add, interject, add, ask a question something that we said with what you have been exposed to, please do so. It is only through questioning stuff that we're able to fully understand, comprehend what is going on, right? Right, so I'll take that as my cue to go on then. Following, okay. So another reasons for a monopoly might be a large capital outlay, or as we call it in economics, a sunk cost. So sometimes a firm might not want to enter into an industry because the investment, right, in assets that are needed is very expensive, right? So therefore, everyone just cannot enter into this industry. You know, think of industries like oil, right? You need a big FPSO or a big refinery, right? And there's just an example. The telecommunications. Look at to set up. Um, you need those big telephone towers. You need satellites, right? And what's not. So the capital outlay is one thing that allows monopolies to reap this benefit, because other smaller firms or even mid-level firms cannot afford that sunk cost, despite the benefits that might be there if they enter, right? So large capital outlay, or sunk cost as we call it, means sunk because that is, you're not getting it back, right? Another reason for a monopoly can be a control over a scarce resource, or some natural resource, or some factor of production. We can look at not gold, we can look at diamond, right? As an example. So back in the 1900s, there was a South African company called the Bears, and they control in past tense vast amounts of the diamond reserves in South Africa and other parts of Africa as a whole. And this gave them some sort of monopoly, right? Because they had a control over all of these mines. Um, Again, if you're someone who like going into conspiracy theories, you go down a big wormhole with the amount of conspiracy theories you would find with the bears and what's not. But that is a story for another day. Um, so yeah, by controlling all of the resources, you have a monopoly over it. Another reason monopolies might exist is because of knowledge or having some secret ingredient. If one firm alone knows how to produce a product, or if one firm alone knows the production technique for a product, this will eventually give them monopoly powers because only they essentially can produce it, right? So knowledge or knowing the secret ingredient allows you to benefit from being a monopoly. And there is a last concept called a working monopoly I want us to pay attention to, right? So a working monopoly is a form, a dominant form that has the majority of market share despite there being other competition. So we can cite Google. Google has a monopoly over search engines. Um, if you guys use Windows Edge, you would find that you go to Bing as a default browser a lot of times, but there are other browsers such as Yahoo and this other one called DuckDuckGo. But again, most persons use Google. I'm sure a lot of you online here use Google. And yeah, you indicate in the chat there, yes, you use Google. So you know that Google has this dominant position. And for some reason, we say, let's Google this or whatever. And that all drives this work in monopoly um, for Google, right? So work in monopoly, a dominant form that has the majority market share. And what you're going to do for me when you finish all of that is on this page or this slide, indicate so I can proceed to just talk about first the characteristics, the advantages and disadvantages, and if we have time, the curves today. So indicate for me there. Yes. Actually give me a 1 in the chat. Right. So for those of you who are now doing this topic for the first time, um, we haven't done anything extensive so far, right? Well, we did earlier, however, you might have been If you missed that session on perfect competition and the abnormal profit position, the loss position, that is something you might have to review and then get back to me for some clarification. As I did go through last week on both days in extensive detail. Right? So yeah, moving on, the characteristics of a monopoly market structure. Let's get this out of the way. So firstly, the form is the market slash industry. What do we mean by that? Right? By being the single form is producing for the entire market because they are the only person that exists. They are hence the industry as well, right? Meaning the total number of forms, because it's only one form, it's them, right? So the form is the market and the industry, right? Because they are servicing or satisfying the demands of all persons in the market. There's obviously no competition. There is one seller, many buyers. The product is unique because no one else is producing this product in the market, right? It's unique. For perfect competition, we said it was homogeneous, meaning identical. This one is unique. It's one of a kind, no close substitutes, right? There's imperfect knowledge in the market, meaning you, as a buyer, has no idea of what, or have no idea of what the monopoly is doing, right? Whether it be production techniques, pricing techniques, or wherever else. The firm is also a price maker, meaning they set the price in the market. In the event of GPL, let's use GPL as an example. If in the event that they raise their prices, we have to go with it. They're a price maker, right? As being a price maker and the only play, it allows them to set their price by limiting quantity. And we'll see how all of these come out when we look at the diagram analysis. There are many barriers to entry, as we just explained, right? Legal, control over resources, sunk costs, whatever else. The form is a profit maximizer, as any form is that we've looked at recently, just as any form. They can do what we call price discrimination, which we will look at in detail in a later down class. And abnormal profits can be made in both the short and the long run, right? Remember earlier with perfect competition, we said you can make your abnormal profit, but in the long run, it's always going to result in normal profit. In this case, though, by being there the only producer, they can make abnormal profit in both. However, that does not mean that they can make losses or normal profit. You know, whenever you are on your own, you become complacent because you have no competition. And therefore, if they are run poorly, we are saying you can still experience losses or not the amount of profit you hope for. Right? And I think we all should have those. Very straightforward. We can look at the advantage and disadvantage of this structure, starting with the advantages. Firstly, economies of scale. Being the only producer in the market, you have to service this entire industry. You can therefore implement the latest technology, the best managers. You get financing economies. You're buying in bulk. So you're having to service the entire market. You're able to benefit from these expansion or this high scale of production that you're operating at, right? And benefit economies of scale, which is cost advantages, as we can recall, or a lower average cost, right? Another advantage is what we call new technology. Uh, so a monopoly, despite sometimes it might be in a developing country or maybe a little bit higher rather than a developed country, it can still afford the latest technology and equipment, therefore producing high quality goods because again, it's benefiting from economies of scale, it can afford to do this. Similarly, tying into a very similar um, point, they can undertake research and development to try and come up and invent new techniques to make whatever they are satisfying the market with uh, more efficient, more cost effective, improve the product, improve the manufacturing techniques. So they can invest R&D. And lastly, the last point is that monopolies tend to stick through hard times. We would have seen during COVID a lot of business shut down, right? They shut down because they weren't able to make enough profit. Um, they didn't have a big enough bank account to weather this storm. So you find that monopolies, by being they already have been making abnormal profit, they know that if they survive this year, they will be making more profit. They will stay, right? And it doesn't affect the economy, and portions have a dependable source of this good. So they stick through hard times, they stick through recessions, and they keep flourishing after it. All right. Any questions thus far? Just indicate for me in the chat. How do you stand? Anything you want to add? Let me see. Chandani, Krishan. Any questions from you two in particular? All right. That's good. Joanna, are you following? So the disadvantages quickly. First obvious thing is higher price. If you're the only farm, you're going to take advantage that persons have nowhere to go, um, and they will charge higher prices. This is done by limiting the supply of goods, so prices will be high. And you'll see how all of this happen when we go into the analysis. There is no choice, right? There is no choice. If we want to buy from another producer, we can't. In economics, we call it sovereignty. So there's no consumer sovereignty, right? You can only buy the goods produced by the monopoly, who is the only producer. And lastly, we said in perfect competition, those forms are efficient. However, in this case, the forms are both productive and allocatively inefficient. So productive efficiency, as we remember, means producing at the optimum point, right? Producing at the optimum point. Whereas allocative efficiency, to remind you, means that the firm is not producing the goods in the right quantities demanded by society, right? So again, monopolies are both productively inefficient, meaning they don't produce at their optimum point, they restrict, and this ties into allocative efficiency. They're not producing the amount needed by society. I put all of this on the new page. Right? Yeah. Um, there is potential for greater inequality of income. So as monopolies charge higher prices, you'd find that over time it can lead to inequality, because let's use GPL for example. The prices are high for electricity. Um, everyone is burdened by these same prices. However, someone with a higher income might seek out a cheap alternative such as solar, right? So over time, it leads to persons with more income who can afford an alternative doing such, and those who cannot will not, because they can't afford it. Um, and lastly, there is no incentive to improve products. So think about it. If you don't have competition, the incentive to improve a product is low, because who are you going to lose customers to? What are they going to do? They can't do anything. They just have to buy your product and complain. But at the end of the day, they can't go anywhere, right? Unless for some reason the industry is liberalized, or producers come in and what's not. So I don't want to cite GPL again, but it's just the best example, right? Someone told me earlier that they had a power outage when it rained. So it is what it is for now. So what we go, where do we stand? Where do we plan to go from here? Tomorrow when we come, our next session, we will look at revenue maximization, right? You might look at this and see it looks a bit confusing. Don't worry, we will go through all of this next time, right? We'll stick a pin here for today. Maybe if you want to feel adventurous and do some extra reading, that's fine. Please do so. Right, so there's where we'll stick a pin.